Before moving on to the Rashi, I'd like to digress for a moment so as to put his quotation from the Sifri and the Rishalmi into some form of a context. In the world of man's reckoning, that is, what we refer to as the legal system, one of the pivotal building blocks is the concept of mens rea, a guilty mind. And in common law, the test for criminal liability is usually expressed in a Latin phrase, which means the act does not make a person guilty unless the mind is also guilty. In criminal law, intent is viewed as one of the necessary elements of a crime, in terms of holding a person accountable for his or her actions. And therefore, in jurisdictions that function with due process, the actus reus, the act, must be accompanied at some level by intent to constitute the crime in which the defendant is charged. As a general rule, criminal liability does not attach to a person who acted with the absence of mental fault, and the prosecution, in order to be successful, must demonstrate that there was intent on the part of the accused. Judaism accepts the concept that God knows the thoughts of man, and therefore in that world, man can be held accountable for one's thoughts, for one's intentions. And hence Rashi maintains that although Lavan did not carry out his intentions to harm Yaakov, his wives and children, nevertheless, in the eyes of God, he is held accountable for the mere intent to harm Yaakov. In the words of Rashi, quoting from the Sifri, "Ubishvil shechashav la'asot," because Lavan planned to harm Yaakov, chashav lo hamakom, God considers it, holds him accountable, ki'ilu asa, as if he carried out the act. Accordingly, in the declaration with Arami Oved Avi, the translation is not that Lavan actually annihilated Avi, Yaakov, but rather Lavan intended to annihilate Yaakov, and that intent is treated as if he actually carried out his plans. Hence the justification for its inclusion in the declaration that went along with the bringing of the Bikurim. As Rashi goes on to write, quoting from the Rishalmi, "She'umat ha'olam choshev lahem HaKadosh Baruch Hu," that with respect to the non-Jewish nations of the world, God classifies a machshava ra'ah, an intent, a thought, to cause harm, k'ma'aseh, as if the thought was in actuality carried out. In other words, as the ArtScroll footnote to this Rashi comments, if the plotter did not succeed with his wicked design because he was prevented from carrying it out, or because circumstances changed so that he no longer stood to gain from his evil in the eyes of God, he is nevertheless considered to have carried his plans to fruition. Unless, of course, as the Gemara Kedushin in the name of Ulla notes, if of his own volition he realized that his designs were wicked and abandoned them, then he is not held accountable for that machshava. There is, however, one caveat, and that is that the accountability of thought alone in the eyes of God is limited to the umot ha'olam, from which it might be suggested that, for whatever the reason, the link between thought and action is not applicable to Bnei Yisrael, and hence, while Lavan was related to Avraham, he was not a direct descendant, and therefore he technically would be considered part of the Ummot Ha'olam. This in contrast to Esav, who was a direct descendant from Avraham, and hence part of the Bnei Yisrael. As such, even if we were to argue that Esav was plotting to annihilate Yaakov and his family, in reality that plan did not eventuate. As part of Bnei Yisrael, he would not be held accountable for intent alone, and therefore acknowledgement cannot be made as part of the Bikurim declaration. With respect to Shechem, the only information that we have regarding a potential threat of annihilation comes from Yaakov himself. "I am few in number, and v'nes v'alai," the surrounding warlords will come together, v'hikuni v'nishmadati, attack me, strike me down, and annihilate me. And therefore, in comparing the three situations, in the case of Lavan, there was the intent, and he is held accountable. With respect to Esav, even if there was the intent to harm Yaakov, because that intent was never carried out, and because Esav was considered a Yisrael, he would not have been held accountable. With respect to Shechem, there's no evidence of any intent other than Yaakov's own fears on the part of the warlords. Therefore, in the declaration made by those bringing the Bikurim from both Esav and Shechem, whatever their thoughts might have been, there was not a threat of annihilation, and hence there was no need to include an acknowledgement of God's intervention in rescuing Yaakov from either of those two situations. As such, Rashi's interpretation for Arami Oved Avi as a reference to Lavan could be justifiable from a textual perspective. The Rebbe in the SICHAH, however, proceeds to dismantle this line of thinking from the standpoint of the Pshuta Shel Mikra.